Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Deb Areguy, and I am happy to welcome you all on behalf of the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council for our event this afternoon. I first would like to start with acknowledging the land that we're on. The Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council exists and operates on the Haldimand Tract. This land is located on the Haldimand Tract, the land that has been promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We acknowledge that historic and current colonization practice continues to disproportionately affect Indigenous people throughout Turtle Island. Given that our topic is on criminalization, we think it's very important to understand that Indigenous peoples are particularly harmed in this way by our colonial systems. The recent news out of Kamloops is sadly only one horrific incident in a long history of harm. We are grateful for the generous involvement of everyone involved in the UPstream speaker series. We sincerely hope that these events inspire equity-based improvements in all of our community safety and well-being. So now I would particularly really like to thank our moderator and panelists for putting themselves out there to have this important conversation today. It takes a lot of courage and emotional energy to have these conversations. We are looking forward to a very open and authentic conversation about the harms that our organizations cause. I thank all of you for taking time to come and engage in this conversation with an open and receptive mind. In the past months, as Crime Prevention Council has been revisiting its vision, mission, and strategic directions, we have been having lots of conversations. We've learned a lot together about this really important topic, and we felt that it was necessary for us to bring this conversation to the broader community, which is why we are having this series of events. A little bit about the format of the event this afternoon. Because this is a Zoom webinar format, we can't see you. You can see us, but we can't see you. Chat has been disabled, but you are able to submit questions at any time through the Q&A function. The Q&A your questions submitted will not be visible unless it is selected to be answered. Questions can be submitted anonymously. Questions may be answered throughout the session, but they also may be saved for after a break. So we will be having first a panel discussion, and then there will be questions taken from the attendees. So a little bit about the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council. The new vision statement that's just recently been approved is that the Crime Prevention Council envisions a safe, equitable, and just community where everyone has access to opportunities to thrive. Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council consists of 40 members who represent a broad range of service sectors and individuals within the community. For many years, the Crime Prevention Council has been focusing on identifying and offsetting the root causes of crime. With many of our discussions, we've been moving away from the concept of crime and looking more at those foundational structures and harms that are the root causes, moving upstream to the source, and instead of treating kind of those further downstream impacts. And what we mean when we talk about harm is we encompass the social, economic, psychological, environmental injury or damage that is inflicted on individuals, communities, and society, either intentionally or unintentionally. And really the goal of the upstream work is to address the harm before it occurs, identifying systemic drivers that cause those harms. So that's certainly a big focus of today's conversation, and focus on building equity for all citizens. And there are a number of foundations to that community well-being overall. So this is an overall series, as mentioned. This is our third in the series, so some of you may have been able to see the first two sessions. All sessions are recorded and will be available on our website, so you can certainly go back and check any of those out. And we have one more session, which is the third on here listed, crime prevention through an upstream lens, that will be offered on Monday evening. So if you haven't had a chance, you can certainly go and register for that. And finally, we do have an ability to keep in contact with Crime Prevention Council. If you'd like to become a friend of Crime Prevention, go to our website, you can sign up and you can receive more information about our events such as these and any other kind of information that's coming out of the council. So without any further ado, I don't want to take away from the important conversation that we're looking to have this this afternoon. I would like to take a moment and introduce our moderator for today. So our moderator is Fitsum Areguy, and we're really pleased to have him. And he is going to be moderating this panel. I'll just tell you a little bit about Fitsum. I really particularly enjoy his bio. Fitsum is not only a Kitchener-based writer, community advocate, journalist, he's also a shawarma poutine connoisseur, and I feel that it's important you all know that. He was voted Waterloo Region's Best Local Writer in 2020. Fitsum is the co-founder and managing editor at Inside Waterloo and an associate producer, casual employee with the CBC Kitchener-Waterloo. He's published in Canadian Dimensions, Waterloo Region Record, Briar Patch Magazine, the Community Edition, and Korea Expose. Areguy's interests focus on human rights, misuses of power, community development, connecting local stories to provincial, national, and global issues through reporting and analysis. This builds on 10 plus years of advocacy and work with complexly marginalized communities as a youth worker, independent facilitator, and inclusion support worker. It also inspired him to launch Textile Magazine, a literary publication and writing mentorship program focused on showcasing diverse writers and artists in Waterloo Region. We're very happy to have Fitsum with us today and all of the panelists who have taken the time to contribute to this conversation. And again, thank you to all of you. So Fitsum, welcome, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Deb, for that warm introduction, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. So, welcome again, and I'm really happy to be here, happy to talk about this with everyone. And I also want to acknowledge and just put forth how much labor and intention and time and care has gone into making this series a reality. So I also want to say thanks to the staff team at the Crime Prevention Council, Deb, Shama, Julie, Abby, Mariana, and Michael. You all are amazing, and I'm grateful for you. So I want to start off with a story. In pre-pandemic times, Saturday nights used to be basketball nights at the Areguy YMCA on Cortlandt Avenue in Kitchener. As many as 30 to 40 youth under or between the ages of 15 and 18 would come to play basketball there. That gym was one of the handful of accessible spots to hoop indoors on a Saturday evening. It was a place where teens joked around, broke a sweat, and sometimes looked for ways to test boundaries. One of the common ways youth like to push buttons is by engaging in long and drawn out processes when it comes to leaving the facility at the end of the night. And so if you ever worked with youth, you might know what I mean when I emphasize the word process. It's groaning and dragging feet, and this is all very normal. And they don't do this to intentionally anger people. They just didn't want to leave, because once they did, that meant that was the end of a night of fun and relationship building in what should be a safe and protected space. I know this from experience. I was a Y kid. I spent my formative years at that YMCA. It was my home away from home. I spent countless Saturday evenings playing basketball and just vibing with my childhood friends, building relationships. And then I became a staff member there. So I know how exasperating it can be at the end of the night to shepherd a group of rowdy youth out of a building when it's time to close up. One night on December 1st, 2018, I happened to be at that gym and I wasn't working at that time. One staff member was supervising the gym. There was another front desk staff member at the front desk. These were my previous coworkers. So that night, as I walked in, I knew most of the youth, but I wasn't working. As though I was closing, the front desk staff turned to the other staff member for assistance to get youth out of the lobby because they were loitering, hanging around, not wanting to leave. The staff member who was in the gym was physically large in stature, and he knew how to raise his voice. He loudly ordered youth to leave. They were not very receptive to his booming overture. Some of them laughed and continued to joke around. This power struggle escalated and ended when the staff member threatened to call the police. Some of the youth scoffed and expressed confusion and anger that the police were being brought into this situation, yet it had the desired effect. They eventually sauntered towards the front door. Later, in conversation with the two staff members, the front desk staff told me that she had the number for dispatch in case the situation with the youth got out of hand. Ultimately, I don't think the staff would have called the police, but what if they had? Would it have turned out like it did on October 3rd of last year, when a 15-year-old Black boy was aggressively pinned down by 3 police officers at the parking lot of Fairview Park Mall in Kitchener for perceived misconduct? There are far too many examples across Canada, Ontario, and Waterloo Region to question whether marginalized communities are criminalized. So, what do communities need to feel safe and supported? We have historically and continue to turn to social service organizations and non-for-profits and faith communities as our best options to support and serve the community. But what if we're wrong about that? What if these communities and organizations are also causing significant harm? So I want to take a pause here because that story is also my introduction. I grew up in this region. Many people who might view this recording later on or are viewing live may know exactly what I'm talking about, who grew up here. And maybe you're not from this region, or that felt very familiar. Maybe you work in these spaces, or you know people who work in these spaces. These are going to be uncomfortable conversations to talk about organizations or groups of people who truly believe they're doing good, but in fact are causing harm. And I invite you to sit in that discomfort and reflect on what that means. These are really difficult but necessary conversations. So next slide. So I want to get a sense of the audience and who's in the room. So I'm hoping that people can respond to the poll. You should see it on your screen. Looking to know, where are you joining us from? Are you from the Waterloo region? Are you from outside? Just general questions, whatever you're comfortable with answering. But I also want to know who has attended the other events in this series. So it looks like most people are coming from Waterloo region. Some are in Ontario, but outside. And some are from in Canada, 14%, but the majority from Waterloo region. So that's great to know. And I also wanted to know if people had attended the previous UPstream events. 26% said that they attended both. 19% said that they attended the Rethink crime event on June 10, and 5% said that they attended the Rethink Our Stories event on June 15. So, and 49%, so the majority said that they hadn't seen either. So that's good to know, and that gives some context about how much to share about what has been talked about, because those events really set the stage for this conversation. But there is still a lot to talk about here that will bring up those conversations. And of course, those other events are accessible as they were recorded and will be shared. So the question, how do we build a fair and just and equitable society? Earlier in the series, we had Jessica Hutchinson talk at length about the process of criminalization and how carcerality and carceral logics are strategies used in the process of criminalization. So when I say carcerality and carceral logics, I'm talking about surveillance, control, punishment, isolation, coercion, compliance. It's about power over someone else, and it's connected to the state. So this is what we mean by carcerality, and carceral logics are what those sort of intangible things that drive carcerality, how they become embodied in our day-to-day. And so following Jessica's event, the next event, Rethink Our Stories, really reinforced what was heard during the previous event, where Black and Indigenous people spoke about how structural violence in their day-to-day lives impacted them beyond the criminal justice system. So to borrow and adapt phrasing from Ronaldo Walcott, what if our social service and health organizations, instead of resisting systemic harms, have reproduced, with some adaptations, the very same racial hierarchies, practices, and violence they claim to be working against? So this is what we're here to explore today, and I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists. Next slide. So We have three fantastic community leaders who are here to talk about this and explore this. I'm going to start off with two general questions that I'll field to each, each panelist will respond to, and then I have specific questions for each panelist that I've prepared. Next slide. So Teneile Warren is an anti-racism educator and equity consultant based in Kitchener, Ontario. Her work centers on the advancement of racialized communities with a particular focus on African, Caribbean, and Black immigrant communities. Through her professional practice, she consults with public and private institutions on addressing anti-Black racism and fostering racial literacy. She is currently the Equity and Inclusion Officer at the Waterloo Region District School Board. Next slide, thank you. So Karen Spencer, appointed Executive Director in 2017, Karen has more than 25 years of progressive leadership experience at Family and Children's Service of the Waterloo Region. Beginning as a frontline child welfare worker in 1994, Karen is committed to the safety and well-being of children and youth and families. She applies a trauma-informed lens to her work, which helps better understand how parents can get into struggles of their own and need help. Karen is committed to truth and reconciliation and working from an anti-oppressive practice equity lens, focused on reducing the overrepresentation of First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and Black children in the child welfare system. And then we have Megan Ruttan Walker. Meg Walker is a climate justice organizer in Waterloo Region. As part of the 50x30 Waterloo Region, she is campaigning for the region to commit to a 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. So again, welcome. I invite you now to turn on your cameras. And I will start with a question that I think the three of you can respond to, and we'll start with Teneile. So criminalization and carcerality extend beyond the criminal justice system. Harm against marginalized communities exists in many organizations. Can you speak on why and how carceral logics exist in the systems you work in, and how they trickle down into our communities and homes?
Thanks, Fitsum. I think that the answer to that question is simpler than we think. Our society is built on carceral logic because the colonial society is rooted in the plantocracy structure. So we live in a community that was built by people who created a system based on ethnic cleansing, erasing one community for European white settlers to thrive. And so that is the foundation, and we've basically built up from there. When we look at the education system in particular, we have to acknowledge that the system was designed specifically to educate those communities, to educate those settler communities. And within that structure, a decision was made to decide that the indigenous people, the Black people, the enslaved Africans, were not worthy of education. They were savages. And so that system continues to exist today. And that's completely the root, the foundation, the cultural underpinnings of carceral logic. It's in our parenting. It's in the way that we use punishment to define goodness. It's in the way that we withhold things in order to advance puritanical ideals. It's in our relationship with religion. It's in our relationship with a sense of order, being in a line. And if you can't stand in line, what does that mean? So carceral logic is the way the community functions, is what I would say.
Yeah, thank you for that, Teneile. I think your point about the savage, right? The category of the human being really integral to carceral logics. I want to flip over to Meg and sort of ask the same question and pose the same question. The system you work in is climate justice. Criminalization and carcerality. How does this exist in that system?
So who gets to speak on behalf of the climate and who's considered an activist as opposed to a land protector or someone who's just trying to live their life and try to protect themselves and their family and their communities? It comes down to that, essentially. So you'll have white people who are considered activists and they will be less criminalized. I've been to actions where there's far less police presence at those actions, as opposed to when we try to center specifically climate justice and Indigenous people, land protectors. There will always be a far greater police presence. Even we once had people turn our electricity off because we had an Indigenous drumming circle, for instance. So who gets to speak and advocate for the climate and the environment, and why? It comes down to it. We also have entire movements of climate activists who are white, who have not been acting in solidarity with the people who have been trying to protect the land and protect themselves from colonialism, which is one of the root causes of climate change. We have these movements who say they are the movement of movements, who say that they are the most important climate activist movement, specifically and purposefully try to get themselves arrested. So they use carceral logic as a leverage point, without understanding that racialized people, Indigenous people, Black people cannot use the same sorts of levers. And they are specifically marginalizing those people again out of their activism movements. And generally speaking, I think the misunderstanding that climate justice and white supremacy need to be, white supremacy is at the root of climate change. It's not just a technological fix. And these people are always criminalized for self-protection and not understanding that this is a justice issue. This is a bigger issue than technology.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I'll now pass it over to Karen to respond to that question as well. Just building on what Teneile and Megan have talked about, there's an acknowledgement of white supremacy as being connected to carceral logics. So carceral logic, carcerality, criminalization, how does this connect to the child welfare system?
Thanks, Fitsum. And yeah, I'm happy to go after Teneile and Megan, because I think what I have to say fits really nicely with what they've just talked about. So our system represents carceral logic. And as you were describing it, Fitsum, I'm sitting here going, yes, that's us, right? So our roots are in colonialism. And, Family and Children's Services started with a group of volunteers, and their goal was to save children from abuse and neglect. So what does that mean? That means that they're saving children from their parents. It means parents are harmful. It means there's a problem with the parent. That's a very different approach from what can we do to support a parent? Let's understand what's going on with that parent. It's a very different system from thinking a parent has a right to ask for help to raise their children, right? So I think we have, we're not the police, but I don't know if you've heard the phrase soft policing. I certainly think that describes the system that I lead in Waterloo Region here. I can say that maybe there were good intentions, but that's not good enough. We have harmed children and families. Our system has harmed children and families. Our system is based on surveillance. And, as I reflect on that surveillance and I look at the data, I can tell you that has impacted Indigenous and Black children more in Waterloo Region. So I want to share some statistics with you. Right now, if you are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis child in Waterloo Region, you are 13 times more likely to be in the care of Family and Children's Services than a white child. If you are a Black child in Waterloo Region, you are 3 times more likely to be in care of Family and Children's Services than a white child. So I say this is a crisis in Waterloo Region and something that we all need to pay attention to. The other area that I really think I need to highlight is this whole child saving and what happens when kids come into the care of Family and Children's Services. So, the Crime Prevention Council, we've been a member of, they've been partners with us for a number of years. Several years ago, they led a report on crossover kids. And what did we find? We found that many of the kids that were leaving the child welfare system, we're heavily involved with the criminal justice system. We have to take ownership and responsibility for that. Many of those kids left our system without adequate support, and they were lonely and they were isolated. So I'll stop there. I could, as you can tell, go on and on and on, and I know there's lots to say, but that's the roots of our system. You know, I can say, you know, in Waterloo Region, we want to do something about that. We want to turn things around.
Karen, I really thank you for those stats. They really paint a picture and provides a grounding, and we're definitely going to loop back to it. So I'm gonna turn to Teneile and build off what you're saying, Karen, around you know, who gets to make decisions for youth, and what that speaks to is really the agency of youth. And so Teneile, you know, there's a lot that we community members, parents, etc., don't understand about the day-to-day realities of youth. There's a gap in knowledge that obscures our understanding of what youth need. So in addition, there is not a lot we know about what happens in schools, which leads to the criminalization of youth. And I'm talking, you know, for example, the school to prison pipeline, which has been shown in research. So what are some insights you can share about this in the Waterloo region, these day-to-day realities that we don't understand and how that leads to criminalization?
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on something Karen was saying, but before that, because I think we'd be remiss in not making that direct relationship between the white saviorism roots of the child welfare system that still perpetuate today and the residential school genocide and the 60s scoop. I mean, I think those connections are important because it very much is a significant example of how that operates, this idea of separation, and that very much is tied to colonialism and to white abolitionist theory. So when we look at white abolitionist theory, as we're 2 days away from Juneteenth and then August 1st for Emancipation Day in Canada, when we look at the history of that, there was significant debate around child labor and significant debate around preparing the soon-to-be free enslaved people to continue to provide labor. And a lot of that was based on the failures that they discovered in the ability to colonize Indigenous people. And much of that language and that conversational structure contributed to the child welfare structural system. And it hasn't really changed, even as people have made attempts to shift from white saviorism to an identity-rooted perspective that understands that families ultimately, even though they may harm, know what's best for their child. And that moves into education. So we know that Ontario's public education system was designed and developed by Edgerton Ryerson. We also know that Ryerson was crucial in the designing of the residential school system. We cannot separate those ideologies. We also know that segregated schools, quite uniquely in Canada, came after Canada had schools. And so this was something that white families advocated for and went on for an extended period of time and didn't shift until Ontario had its first Black representation in Leonard Brathwaite. And so that was 1965. There are people who come into the system to educate who have no idea of this history, these deep-rooted relationships to colonial violence, to genocide, and have not investigated the ways that the structure of the Ontario education system aligns with the plantocracy structure of who is at the top and who holds power. And so within that hierarchical process, we erase all rights of the child. And we know that the UN is continually saying children have rights. We've erased their voice, we've erased their autonomy. And as you trickle that down from white children to Indigenous children, to Black children, to racialized children, to immigrant children, those rights disappear more and more and more and more and more. That is embedded into the structure. The other thing is, quite similar to policing, the structures that are embedded into the education system to protect the people within those systems, those unions and teachers associations, they are least committed to the rights of the child. their primary design and purpose is to protect the adult in the space. And so there's an embedded idea that adults ultimately will know what's right, and adults will make the best decisions. And it's interesting to me that we allow adults to be fallible, we allow adults to be forgivable, but we do not offer that same kind of grace and empathy to youth and children. And we cannot separate that ideology from the ways in which enslavement and the plantation structure and the residential school structure positioned children as bodies, as the ultimate property that could be shifted from one space to the next at will. And that parents were not entitled to the right to know what happened to their children, which is a huge part of why we're discovering these bodies. A simple example is the Ministry of Education does not mandate across school boards that parents be involved in the conversations around transitioning children from one school to the next. So here you have adults who teach children making decisions based on their ultimately subjective assumptions about what's best for them at the next stage, and they don't have to consider the parent's opinion. So we're also taking away their familial right, the people who should know them best to have voice for them. The other thing is we are constantly, we have a structure of teacher hierarchy. And within that, if a child makes a mistake, it becomes something that needs to be corrected immediately. And that continues beating down on the rights of the child. It's embedded in the way that we put information out there. The information on what kids need to know about their role and how they can advocate for themselves in the system is written in inaccessible language. It's hidden, and it's not a part of those entry conversations. We don't put it out on the table. These are your rights. This is who you get to be. This is a space that should center you. Instead, we withhold this information in hope that it is never challenged. And so all of that is embedded into the system. The system is designed to protect itself. All systems are designed to protect themselves. And so one of the main things that we do is silence. We silence children's voices. We silence their families' voices, and we silence their community's voices simply by not letting them know that you have a right to challenge this system.
I want to build on that and go to you, Megan. What Teneile talking about in this assumption of what people need. I'm seeing a link here, a connection to what I hope you can explain to our audience around eco-fascism, eco-apartheid, and white supremacist ideology that blames the climate crisis on overpopulation and migration. I'm wondering if you can speak to that connection and build on what Teneile is sort of bringing up here.
Well, I think it's great because she brought up white saviorism, and climate circles have so much of that. We see a lot of these really prominent climate leaders who are white, and they're in the global north, and they are speaking about saving us as though humanity is just this broad swath of people and we're all responsible the same ways for climate change, and we're simply not. The global north has been extracting resources from the global south for years. You know, our civilization that we're trying to save is built on slavery and colonialism and forced labor. So what we're trying to save is essentially colonialism. It's a colonial structure. And we forget about all of the movements in the global south and in racialized communities and Black communities and indigenous communities who have been working towards this, right? So the white saviorism completely elides all of that, gets rid of everything. So white saviorism also and white supremacy also function two ways in climate spaces often enough. There's the techno-optimism that, you know, it even happens in spaces like the Green New Deal. Oh, the global north will be the one to fix this, right? America, Canada, we will organize and we will fix this. It'll be a technological transition focused primarily on jobs, without acting in solidarity with people in the global south. And I think that solidarity is very key if we're going to undermine white saviorism and white supremacy in climate spaces. There's also this idea that we can't fix it, that there's nothing that we can do. This sort of doomism that is also very white, that suddenly these climate impacts come in and we can't do anything about it, we can't organize around it, it's too late. Despite the fact that there are people across the world who are not white, who have been experiencing these impacts for decades, into centuries. If we're going to talk about when climate change started, when the crisis really started, you can talk about North American colonization, right? Julian Neustadt, Mary Heglar, they write about these things. This is not the first existential crisis. This is not the first end of the world. This has been happening over and over again. So I think that white saviorism is especially insidious in climate spaces because we pretend that this is just going to be a technological fix, and we like to ignore the root causes because white fear and white hope almost, they center themselves. We can save ourselves. We can save ourselves without thinking about how, or we can't save ourselves without thinking about how the actual root causes are white supremacy. This sort of idea of acceptable loss. The reason why we have the 2 degrees Celsius climate target at the UN is because Africa didn't matter to people at that conference. It's because we think that there are acceptable sacrifice zones, and those sacrifice zones are going to get bigger and bigger. And you look at American South, New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, and all of these places where historically slaves have been taken over and they ended up living in these areas. We still think that those places are acceptable sacrifice zones. They are specifically racialized. They are specifically Black. And it's fine that we continue to emit into the air this carbon dioxide that we know is going to make everything worse. And it's hurting, people who are Indigenous and Black and racialized first. So this whole idea that it's okay, we have progress, we have this progress, and it's going to continue to hurt people, but it's progress for some of us. And then we have the overpopulation, people who, quite frankly, enrage me. We have these people saying, no, we have to close our borders. It's too late to do anything about climate change. So we have to close our borders, and we have to blame people who are the least responsible for climate change because there's too many of them and because they're not white. And it's a dehumanization of these people. They are somehow part of nature. They don't have any self-will. They have no, their appetites are too big. They can't stop breeding. This is the rhetoric that we hear all the time in climate spaces, and overpopulation rhetoric is entirely too accepted in climate and environmental spaces. So, and then comes, another carceral logic is immigration. So if we think that the problem is other people and not how we consume, those of us who have more privilege and more ability to consume, if it's not us, then it's other people, and then we have to close our borders, these imaginary lines, and we have to make sure that anybody who tries to transgress those borders, we have to put them in prison because we have to keep them out, because who gets the resources and who gets to benefit from this transition, who gets to benefit from these resources that are already stolen? That's what they're saying, essentially. They are determining that, there's an individual that works at UBC, and I won't name him, but he has worked on overpopulation, and he's also worked on nation building and, family. He's very family focused. This is his whole shtick, is that he wants to make sure that the myth of nation is, especially in Canada, is preserved, that that order is basically imposed in a world that is stricken by climate chaos, and is essentially you cannot just close things off. If you were doing that, you are killing people, and it's going to be primarily racialized people who are not white, because this is how the climate change has impacted people, right? Because of the whole history of colonization. So you can't really extract white supremacy from any of these problems, and to do so, essentially they try to control it with incarceration. Does that answer your question? Kind of
yeah, no, it does, and there's a lot there that I think we're gonna have to loop back to. But yeah, your point about borders, demarcating who is a citizen and who isn't, what makes a nation state, I think was really, really salient. But there were a lot of things that jumped out that I hope to get back to. Teneile, I saw that you raised your hand, so I'm gonna let you jump in here.
Yeah, there are a number of things that Meg said that jumped out at me as well, and I think that there's an opportunity here to frame some of the connections in almost all of what we do, because when we're talking about ecofascism, we're talking about border control, we're talking about migrant justice, we're talking about mobility justice, we're talking about transnational colonialism, which is modern colonization. And so, one of the key components of ecofascism is the lack of access to healthcare for female bodies in what we would call developing countries in continents like Africa, in the Caribbean, because that ties into the colonial idea that these individuals, these communities, these racialized identities are not deserving of that kind of choice because they are still savages. When we talk about that white saviorism are the systems that white religious groups that are missionaries that go into these countries and communities that teach English. So there's an entire system designed to go into communities to teach English in order to create labor structures for the colonizer spaces, for North America, for Canada, for the US, for the UK. When we look at the history of Filipino workers, we know that this is something that was intentionally done. The setting of Americanized schools in order for them to come in and be the nurses in the LTC homes, in the hospitals, in the medical field. And we see it here in Canada as well. There's an overrepresentation of Filipinos in that system. We talk about temporary migrant workers and how they're treated within the system. And this idea that we're entitled to mistreat these bodies because they're international bodies, while simultaneously going to the spaces that we've robbed of their skills and their talent so that we can have access, that we can control this land, that we don't have to do menial jobs and pay full price, because we believe that by colonizing a space, the space is continually indebted to us. And so we replace indigenous bodies with enslaved African bodies, and replace enslaved African bodies with the indentured bodies, and replace those bodies with migrant workers that we push and pull whenever we feel like. And that is very much defined by racial identity, because if we look at the history of the domestic worker program, we know there are Eastern European domestic workers, but the white Eastern European domestic workers were given immediate rights, whereas the Caribbean domestic workers were subjected to abuse and violence and had to advocate for that. So we see those systems continually replicating themselves. And it again comes back to child welfare, because when these bodies come into our space and they're abused and they're treated violently, it perpetuates that cycle of overrepresentation, because we're not recognizing the relationship between ongoing colonialism, the white saviorism model that essentially destroys Black, Indigenous, racialized migrant identities for feeding the system of we get to save your children. And the education system with this assimilation model that makes little space for those identities to come in and inform the curriculum, inform how we learn, inform how things work. So we don't invite these bodies, the ones that do get through the border, to be a part of the conversation. We invite them to assimilate them so that they continue to feed our labor and capitalistic structure and to maintain whiteness at the top. The ones who break through, that we uphold and praise and say, look at President Barack Obama, that is how the white saviorism becomes white denial, and it feeds itself and says, oh, no, we're not the bad people here. You can make it. You can make it.
Yeah, when you were what you were bringing up around this control over bodies, reproductive justice, I was thinking a lot about how reproductive justice advocacy is you can dig into an expansive framework that was pioneered by Black women in the 1990s. But I'm thinking about something a little more recent in BC and across other provinces, where it was found out that hospitals were sending and social workers were sending birth notices when Indigenous people in the child welfare system were about to have a baby, essentially criminalizing them in the womb. And so I kind of want to flip over to Karen and to talk about that connection between reproductive justice, control, assumed knowledge over what families need, and how the child welfare system is so ingrained in that. And you've spoken to that a little bit before, but I'm hoping you can build on what Megan and Teneile have been talking about.
Yeah. And, first of all, Fitsum, I want to just thank Teneile for making the connection between child welfare and the legacy of residential schools and the 60 Scoop. And what I want to say is absolutely. That's the legacy of our work. And right now in Canada, it's 52% of the children in care are Indigenous. There are more children in the care of child welfare than there was in the height of the residential schools. So, definitely, I think this is an area where white supremacy, white superiority shows up in our system. And, there is an assumption made that, we know how people should parent, and it's all one way. And it's all based on a colonial white system. And, yes, birth alerts, did impact marginalized bodies more so than white bodies, just like the whole system does. We're not doing that anymore. We're learning, but we can't learn by talking to ourselves. And I think that's some of the arrogance that I hear my colleague panelists today talking about. We have to get out of ourselves and start listening, because our way isn't the right way. But yet that has been, I think, the mantra for so long. So I'll give you an example, a local and a recent example. And this is just all within the context of learning. But, we had a parenting program here that we were very proud of. It was a parenting program grounded in understanding a parent's history of trauma. And we went, I went, I'll just put my hand up and say me, to one of our Indigenous partners and said, hey, would you like to adapt this parenting program to meet the needs of, Indigenous parents? And she was so gracious and kind. She looked at me and she said, well, thank you. But are you implying that we don't know how to raise our kids? Like that we should take your program and adapt it to meet our needs? And that's just an example of what happens in the system all the time, right? Around white superiority. We assume that our way is the best way. So, when I say we're looking at changing the system, we're not looking at changing the system ourselves. We've got to take a pause here and to stop and to listen and to unlearn and to relearn. So I think that, I don't know if that answered your question, Fitsum, but that's certainly what came to my mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it makes me think about, Teneile had mentioned earlier about the connection between the child welfare system, or the questions about the child welfare system, and the complicity around the residential school system. And so, I don't think this is an elephant in the room. We're talking about things. It's all on the table. In the wake of the 250 Indigenous children found buried under the Kamloops residential school, many are interrogating the ways in which the child welfare system perpetuates this harm. So we live in the wake of this colonial history, especially as you note that Indigenous children, Black children, racialized children are overrepresented in the foster care system. And in the modern First Nation school system. So could you reflect on this history of colonial violence and maybe how this understanding factors into the day-to-day operations of family and child services?
Yeah. So I did talk about, the overrepresentation of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in care. And, essentially what happens is when we take children away from their parents, from those communities, we're really separating them from their culture. Because by and large, our foster care system today is made up of primarily white families. And so that's a way I think that we continue to perpetuate the legacy of residential schools. I know, Megan, you talked about, nations, right? And having, the right to decide. And that's something that we need to grapple with, right? We have many Indigenous nations in Canada. And, what they're saying is, we want the right to decide, how to provide service to children and families. we know that it gets perpetuated in our system today. And, we're working very hard not to have children come into the foster care system. Unfortunately, that still does happen. But one of the ways that we're doing things differently is by having a specialized team here called the 2-row understanding services team to provide services to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis families and children that we're working with.
No, thank you for that. I really appreciate you speaking to that. I'm wondering now, I'm looking at the time, it's almost 3:30, and I want to check in with the panelists to know how are you feeling? Should we take a break soon? I want to leave space for Teneile and Megan to respond to some of that. So let me know how you feel. We also have questions that we're going to get to right before. I think we're going to wait till after the break to respond to those questions. So maybe one more round of comments and reflections, just building on what's been said, if that's okay. How do you feel? Okay. So I'll ask then, the reality that many people who step up to become foster parents, are privileged in many ways. Many of them come from faith communities. So, that's not innocuous. Nina Deshane, an Indigenous elder at Wilmot Family Resource Center, recently pointed out that it was the churches who ran residential schools with the state, yet the churches seem to avoid any sort of criticism. So, Teneile, I was hoping you could speak to that involvement or role of faith communities, the Catholic Church or other churches, in perpetuating some of this harm in the systems that we're talking about, in particular the education system.
Yeah, when we look at colonization and conquest, you're looking at strong religious institutions, and when Protestantism started to grow, it very much was the birthing of new religious institutions to challenge Catholicism as a religious storm, but not to break the power and that unhealthy relationship between state and church. And so when we again go back to that structure of enslavement and white abolition theory, when they said, okay, we need to break the savage, how are we going to do it? How are we going to get them speaking one language? They used religion. And they did the same thing with the Indigenous community, because religion is white supremacist softness. Christianity is white supremacist softness. This is where we do good things. And so all of those biblical teachings are manipulated against the collectivism cultural practices of Indigenous society. And so it makes it quite manageable for faith-based communities to hold that kind of power, because there are elements of Christianity that are pulled from Indigenous spiritual practices. And so those small connections make it possible for faith-based groups to appear as soft policing, as Karen has made the point. And so within that, you do have groups that have become, so you do have, Indigenous Catholics, you have a strong, Black religious community. Those things make it quite difficult for us to see the harm within faith-based communities' role in modern colonialism and child harm, child welfare structures. When we look at the principles and the pulling of how did we define social norms, how do we define the family, how do we say a family is safe, we're looking at the biblical definition of what a family is. And all of those definitions are counter to Indigenous culture. They're counter to African culture. You gave the point about to be a foster parent is a very privileged thing. And that is extremely true, because I have tried to become a foster parent, and then I abandoned the process. because the process of becoming a foster parent, the process of becoming an adopted parent, the questions that are asked are completely asked through a white colonial lens. The what they demand and expect of you, you have to have a certain amount of wealth to become a foster parent, because the decision is that you're going to commit full time, which again is a colonial format based on the idea that there's some male breadwinner out there and the women are at home taking care of the children, and that formula has rarely adapted to meet people where they are. And so that excludes significant marginalized identities who are caring for children, but they have 3 or 4 jobs. When you're talking about the homes that are required, which we could bring housing into this, and the CMHC model that does not invest significantly into large family homes, which entirely impacts the foster care system and entirely impacts marginalized bodies. All of that comes back to this religious idea, because the idea of family is rooted in the biblical definitions of family. The male, the wife, the child, the wife is caring, the male is off going and doing work, and somebody's at home. And that all kind of moves through. And whenever colonists were making their decisions, before Christopher Columbus decided he was going to discover the world, he went and got a blessing. So this is also how colonialism erases any guilt in the choices and actions that it takes in harming Indigenous bodies, Black bodies, and other bodies. It goes to the church. And therefore, when it wants to do something that it knows is wrong, it uses religion to do that, because you can justify that this is an act done in the name of God.
Yeah, thank you for that, Teneile. Megan, I wanted to leave space for you to jump in if you wanted to build on Teneile's comments. But if not, we can go to the break.
I'll just comment that a few years ago, I think 2015, the Catholic Church came out with Laudato Si, which is how we care for our creation. And it was very broadly applauded in climate circles. And I think that, again, as Teneile was saying, they don't take responsibility for the structures that they were responsible for putting in place to begin with. And these structures are also responsible for climate change and extractive economies, which includes slavery and colonialism. And I think that we're never going to get anywhere on this, quite frankly. So it's great that these white structures are trying to find space and they're trying to work on this. But unless we get to the root causes of this, we're not going to fix it, essentially.
So I think that's a good note. Well, it's a note to end on. It's 3:30. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. After that break, we'll respond to some of the questions in the chat. And then we're going to talk about possible solutions for resistance, activism, to push back against these oppressive systems that we're talking about. So let's take that break and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, so welcoming people back. Hope people are still with us. It seems like looking at the participant list, people still are. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A and read out some questions and answer them directly, or invite panelists to answer them directly. I think first and foremost, there is an anonymous attendee raising some important points that I'm going to address directly. The question they asked was, why are there no Indigenous people speaking to Indigenous issues in the systems being spoken to? Ostensibly, the same anonymous attendee asks or says, Indigenous people, nothing about us without us. These are valid statements. Absolutely. I think we always need to make space for Indigenous voices. There are obviously the constraints of how many people you can have on a panel. And I'm going to direct some of your, if you have questions or concerns about how the panel was put together, the Crime Prevention Council is more than willing to engage with you on these questions and concerns. They welcome this dialogue. They welcome uncomfortable conversations. If you're willing to share your contact info, they can reach out. And I'm sure that the staff can share their contact info with you in the chat. And I'll also say, I'll read out your question. Are we not perpetuating what it is you're talking about when there is no Indigenous people speaking to Indigenous issues? Again, reiterating that this is very valid, and I invite you to engage with the Crime Prevention Council on that issue. And your last question, again, ostensibly the same person, why isn't the CAS or CAS Indigenous Specialized Team here to speak on this? I think in the construction of the panel, we're inviting system leaders to talk about the problems in their systems. Karen being the ED, I believe ED of Family and Child Services, is the leader of that system, and so can speak to it and take accountability. But I think that this question does open up possible opportunities in the future for the CS Indigenous Specialized Team to speak to our community. So thank you for those questions and those comments, and I do invite more engagement. So we have a question here from Jenny, K for W, Kitchener-Waterloo Community Ward. I appreciate your honesty, Karen, about what has happened with FNCS Waterloo Region. How do you think you can change this system? I feel like it needs to be dismantled and a new one started. And Jenny had also asked a question about how you think there can be change when the child welfare system, even when an Indigenous agency is self-governing, are still following colonial rules and systems. So I'll flip that to you, Karen, to respond to that.
Yeah, those such important points. And I do want to go back to the first comment around why don't we have representation here today from the two-row understanding services team, and Fitsum, you did answer that, I think, very well. But I would say that the members of that team would probably say the same thing. I will say that they do want to speak themselves on their own behalf. And to the question that you directed to me, Fitsum, I just will say that I don't know, right? I don't know the answer to that question. That's my honest answer. And I'm the executive director at Family and Children's Services, and maybe I should know that answer, but I don't. I can tell you that the ministry is embarking on a child welfare redesign, and I do ask myself that same question: is it possible for child welfare to really, change, to redesign itself, or does it need to be dismantled? I think those are really important questions, and I am interested in having, more conversation about this, because the honest answer is, I'm not sure. I think we are, we are a system that has felt like we've had all the answers. We don't have the answers, and it's time to listen and to learn. And as I said earlier, to unlearn and to relearn. And so in that process, do we dismantle everything and start all over again? Maybe. I know the other comment you made was, I think, in relation to the child well-being agencies that are developing across the province. So for those of you that don't know what that is, those are agencies that are led by an Indigenous community that serve those children and families. But you're right. The same standards apply. The same tools apply, and those standards and those tools are rooted in the colonial system. Now, those organizations are adding in the cultural element to it, just as we are doing with our two-row understanding services team. But living through that, I can tell you, there's all kinds of challenges with it.
Thanks, Karen. So Abby, I see that there was a question that was answered by staff. I'm going to read it out anyways, because I think it is a good point. Can the panelists explain the racism that is endemic to the healthcare system, and why rethinking things doesn't just end with defunding carceral organizations? So while we don't have any representatives specifically from the healthcare system, we know that systems, which I'll also define as systems of domination, overlap and intersect with each other. And so racial capitalism, one such system, is present in each of these organizations and sectors, and is a significant driver of criminalization. So there are links between the education system and the healthcare system that impact youth and communities and families. And I'm sure that our panelists could respond to those links to the healthcare system if they felt like they'd be willing to field those questions. I'm going to get just a heat check. Do you think, Teneile, Karen, Megan, we could talk about the healthcare system and how it connects to your sectors and criminalization? Yeah, why not? Okay. So, Teneile, let's start with you. Let's talk about the relationship between healthcare, education, and these systems of domination that overlap and intersect.
I read the question, and I think it's important to recognize that the healthcare system is also a carceral system, because it decides who gets care. And again, much of our healthcare system was built on the robbing and appropriating of medicinal practices from the indigenous people and the enslaved people. That ties back to the reproductive justice we're talking about. When we look at reproductive healthcare supports in particular, we see these strong connections to practices that were developed in Africa. And so when we talk about all of these systems, the body is biological and it's all connected. And so it does impact our physical health. When we go into spaces, there are significant relationships between the healthcare system and our policing structure and our justice system. There's a lot of restraint in healthcare systems. The last time I was at, Grand River, there was a gentleman that was in a room who was clearly having a manic episode, I would say. And there were two police officers outside, and he's banging on the door, and the nurses are kind of just walking by, and here he is essentially in this makeshift prison in the middle of a care space that has, in my estimation, the tools, skills, and knowledge available to respond to that. But first, we have to criminalize and go through the criminal process before you're deserving of healthcare. Even the nature of the questions that are asked within the healthcare system structure, there's almost an elimination of criminal activity, association, relationship with any type of criminality before even getting to care. And when you look at the education system, and I'm including mental health and well-being, I'm including psychological assessments as well in overall healthcare, because all of that is our health. When you look at the education system, you see a disproportionate diagnosis of marginalized youth. You see a disproportionate being diagnosed as having significant mental health issues. We know that when we know of traumatic history within a family, especially if that family is Black or Indigenous or racialized, that becomes how the student is defined and further inflicts upon how they might be overdiagnosed. And I know that Megan is going to get into this, but when you start to think about the ways that relationship between climate justice and healthcare, and you look at that in developing countries, that we as a country are raping. So we can talk about the mining structures in Africa and how that's impacting healthcare. We can talk about that within the Caribbean as well, the ways in which we are invested in pulling produce from those countries to bring them here, and what that means for the food that's left for those people, what it means for soil erosion, what it means for forestry protection in those countries. That will impact their healthcare and well-being, because it impacts their livelihood, it impacts their air, their access to clean oxygen, it impacts their water. All of these things are connected, but I'll give it to Meg to pick up from there.
No, you're absolutely correct. And the links between colonialism and healthcare in different countries. I mean, even our solutions, quite frankly, the lithium mining that we're going to need for these solar panels, it impacts the healthcare and the well-being of people across these regions that we depend on them. We pretend there are no people there, but these are the people that are doing the mining. These are the people that are drinking the water from the mining. And if you think about even more close to home, who lives in these areas with the coal plants or the nuclear plants? Redlining is a huge problem, and these communities start from birth with health problems. right? And pollution affects mental health, right? We see a lot of infertility, different kinds of developmental disorders because of the pollution that we're putting in the air. And then what we end up having is that it happens with incarcerated people in general, where climate impacts come down. There's prisons with absolutely no air conditioning, absolutely nothing to help these people live through the impacts that we're going to see and that are going to accelerate. But we also see where people with mental illnesses are abandoned. A couple of years ago, there was a fire in California, and two mentally ill people, or people they were in the back of an ambulance and they were abandoned and left there to die. And then it comes down to, the incarcerated people who are forced to fight fires in California, right? What kind of health problems are they going to have? Are they going to be supported for the work that they have done and make sure that they have health benefits, or have all of these extra things to live that we all need? They're basic human right. Climate justice is about having the basic human, the rights to live in a changing climate. And also, part of climate justice is having access to ethnically appropriate food sovereignty. What is it? How are we feeding ourselves? So it's not just an issue of taking the produce and the food, essentially stealing these food from these people who produce it, and they don't get to benefit from it. But also, how do we feed ourselves here? And who gets to access these community gardens that are not only good for our bodies, but they're good for our mental health. They're good for, they're good for everything. And it's about community building. Who gets access to green spaces here in Waterloo region, right? Who gets access to the housing that is safe? And we haven't mentioned the fact that how many residences that are on reservations have mold in the walls, and people are not given access to basic needs. And part of that is from colonialism, but it's also going to be part of our transition into a climate safe future, is making sure that we have equitable distribution of these resources, right? And not just here, but across the world.
I'm smiling because we're talking about such interconnected systems, because they are, and these systemic issues require systemic solutions. And Karen, you've pointed out to me, only 10% of calls to child welfare are about child abuse. Right? You've been very open about the reasons child welfare become involved are because of a lack of resources, because of poverty, because of a lack of housing. These are all what we call upstream issues, which is what this whole series is about. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, and this was also brought up in the Q&A about, if we acknowledge that the child welfare system, an extension of the state linked to the criminal justice system in many ways, is harmful, what are better ways families can receive support and resources? And if that precludes the child welfare system, then what does that mean for the future and necessity of FNCS?
Good. Okay, so I think you read my mind, Fitsum, or we were quite in sync. I feel like right now we're really talking about access to resources and who we exploit. I'm going to add in there, who do we report? Because that's the link, the direct link, right, between the healthcare system and family and children's services. But yeah, I want to talk about this. So what we're best known for is protecting children from child abuse and neglect. It's only 10% of the calls we ever receive. Most of what we work with, right, are health issues. They're families that are doing their best. And what's driving the referral to family and children's services are health issues, right? They are issues related to poverty, homelessness, social isolation, addictions, and mental health issues, often driven by a history of trauma. So, it is a really big question, I think, that needs to be asked. And it really goes back to, what is the system that we have today, and should we still have it? Is there room to dismantle the system? So, I'll just say this. We spend in the province of Ontario $1.5 billion on child welfare services. Child welfare services get involved once a problem is really intensified. It's pretty serious by the time somebody calls family and children's services most of the time. So let's just say that. Wouldn't it be better to invest money in those early upstream prevention services before something happens and at the community level. So I really think that these are important questions that we need to ask ourselves. And, I do represent, sort of one system leader here, but we all intersect, which has been identified. And I think the change needs to be collective change. We need to do it together. We need to ask these same questions of each of our systems.
So absolutely. And, I'm thinking about this anonymous attendee who brought up this point about, nothing about us without us. Who is making the decisions, right? Who is at the decision-making table? I think this is really, really salient and important to talk about when we talk about this systemic change. It isn't even just about inviting people with lived experience, because then you're inviting harm in different ways. We need expertise, but you also need funding and resources at the very, very beginning, right as upstream as you can get to ensure that capacity is built, but also trusting communities have what they need. So Teneile, I mean, you work closely with youth and families in your role in the education system. How do things change? How do we move forward? What are solutions to address some of these complex harms and issues? And who does that really fall on?
Yeah, that's an important question, and I think it's also important to note that I first started working with youth who are harmed by the system, so youth within the juvenile system, youth within the programs for the troubled youth within the education system, and through community groups. And I think an important point to name here, as we lean into nothing about us without us, is how whiteness and white supremacy can co-opt that concept through the colonial practice of consultation and committees and advisory groups, because we know that the system kind of decides that it cannot be dismantled. So I'm going to challenge Karen and say that it must be dismantled. Can it be all dismantled all at once? Probably not. But there is no equitable future without abolition, true abolition, not white abolition. So one of the first solutions is, how do we allow communities to lead their change? What we very often do is we bring them to the table as consultants, and then we take that information and we filter it through what works for the system. And then we decide, oh, we've created a model endorsed by the Indigenous community, not recognizing that within that consultation process, when we say we brought these people to give us voice, we've engaged with the youth through this impact survey, that we have not flattened the power structure in that hierarchy, that we hold the power. We almost always, when these committees are formed, there is a goal in mind before. These communities are being consulted with to ensure that there's enough of whatever is said to endorse that goal. So I think the first solution is, how are systems going to formulate a model where they literally give those resources to the communities, allow them to lead that process, and recognize that they are capable of leading that process? Because when we create these committees and consult them, when we take their cultural knowledge or lived experience, because you're reaping from their lived experience, and then you formulate a structure around that, we are no different from the early colonial and colonization systems that say that we need to define the boxes for these groups because they're too savage to lead themselves. So a key solution is systems really stepping out of the way and saying, we will actually just support you, that you actually do get to lead. And we have to think about that. When I think about youth and how many times teachers and social workers are also quite carceral, call FNCS or CAS on families for simply not understanding cultural differences, or looking at a family and recognizing that, oh, wait a second here, there are too many people in this bed, in this room, not realizing the impact of housing costs, not realizing that communal village structure that exists in particular cultural groups. I'm thinking about Eritrean groups, Ethiopian groups, Caribbean groups, Somalian groups, where this is a thing that happens, where literally like, okay, everybody's going to go go and stay over at Megan's house. I'm thinking about how my mother grew up and how in summer she'd go to her cousin's house. There were not enough rooms for the 6 of them. But from the system standpoint, every child of a certain age should have a bed, and the girls should. But poverty does not make that possible for every single family. And then you have people with the power who criminalize that through colonial lenses. So the first solution is systems need to recognize the harm in how they engage with equity. That consultation process, that committee, that advisory group, that is not equity. That is maintaining colonial power and using that power to take away the choice that people have, in that they have to say, well, this is the best we've got. So we have to go to this table. And then in the end, we come to a compromise that is 60% to 40%, 70-30 if I'm trying to be more honest. So, I think that we need to dismantle those consultancy groups, listen to the communities who have the ideas and say, what do you need from us? When do you need it? And let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see this in incrementalism. It's tiny steps forward, promises for employment, things that community need, but it's all gatekeeping. Systems, criminal justice systems, there are huge grants, pools of funding that aren't accessible unless you partner with XYZ organization, right? And that creates all sorts of power imbalances. Megan, I wanted to ask you, just to pick up on this thread of abolition and dismantling and imagining new futures within climate justice and what that could look like.
I think a lot about where we would be if we didn't think about the tropics and a lot of these places where non-white people live, as if we didn't think about them as sacrifice zones and how far ahead of the climate problem we would be. And I do a lot of, settlers and white people, we're in silos and we think of, and we're so used to leading in these spaces. I'm a climate leader in the region. And I think that a lot of what we want to do when it comes down to climate change and climate justice even is we want to control. We still have that white supremacy out front. And essentially what we need to do is we need to stop trying to control, and we need to seed power, and we need to seed visibility, and we need to seed these decisions, the decision making. So there's always pushback from climate advocates who are white saying we all need to be together, we need unity. And I think unity is BS. We need a polyvocal approach, and we need to get out of those silos, and we need to have more nonlinear, more seemingly chaotic engagement around climate justice and around climate action, because that white supremacy it wants to impose order. It's this order of the colonial system. And so that's why I love local organizing, is because you see each other and you see the people who live beside you in your community, and you work together. And it's not about, the nation and the nation state as moving together, or the global platform as moving together towards this one goal. It needs to be messier. And I believe personally in abolition. I do, but I'm not a leader. So what I do is I step back and I support. And you give your labor, and you give your time, and you give your resources to people who are already doing that work. And if a person of color, if a racialized person tells you this matters as much as your fear of climate change, then you get behind that. There's too much talk of there's no racial justice in a climate changed world. Well, no, that is not. That is again centering your own whiteness. That is again centering what you feel is a threat to you, and not to the people who have already been the most impacted by these problems. So I do also believe in dismantling. We function on all these myths. The myth of overpopulation, the myth of that we're going to do this and it's going to be a unified front, and that we're all in this together. We're not all in this together. People are in a different boat. Same storm, different boat. And if we can dismantle that order and sort of let a little bit of chaos in, I think we will get much further in a much much faster.
Yeah. So, I'm thinking about what you're saying, Megan, around who needs to lead, right? I'm thinking about how the global north will engage in voyeuristic ways through tourism, for example, and move through the global south and all these areas that are controlled and dominated through capitalism, through white supremacy, through settler colonialism. And I'm also thinking about the roots of that, right? That sort of that connection to the church and missionary work, and how missionary work was an engine for these systems of harm. And yeah, I wanted to flip it to Neil, because it sort of started on this. We had started sort of here talking about faith communities earlier on. If you can speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, and hopefully from that will lead into the question that I saw in the Q&A. But what I'm going to say to faith-based communities is that you have to lean into radicalism. When Megan talks about that unity, that talk of unity is very much rooted in Christian rhetoric. As someone from a majority Black, heavily colonized country, one of the things that's very distinct from my life are these missionaries walking the street that are all, none of them are Jamaican, they're all white. They're all from different countries, and they're pilfering their faith to me with no understanding of my perspective, my space. When we talk about climate justice, we talk about countries like Jamaica and Trinidad that have privatized beaches. We talk about Cuba, where there are people who literally have never been to Cuba. They've been to the tourist resort. This idea of we get to colonize all these spaces. We get to colonize the space to give us the wealth, and colonize this space so that we can vacation with the wealth that we've earned. And then you have that missionary tourism, and you have that ecotourism, where it all kind of converges. One of a very distinct memory for me was I used to spend a lot of time at my grandmother's house. My grandmother's house is in rural Jamaica. It's on this side of a top of a mountain. There's a flat there. There's a school right there. We play cricket, soccer. It's a beautiful field, but it's also, we know that flat top is limestone and natural gravel rock. And these two missionaries came into the community, saw us playing cricket. I remember we taught them to play cricket, and they decided that they wanted to do something for this community because apparently we needed them. They came here and they saw kids who they probably didn't have on any shoes, and their clothes didn't look perfectly clean. And that's what they saw, playing in what looked like in a community that had really, poor looking houses around them. And so they decided that they were going to make a basketball court on that space. Everyone in the community said, you can't put a basketball court there. They asked the school said, well, technically we don't really own this land, so we can't tell you what to do with it. And so they started to cut out a basketball court in front of my grandmother's house. And by the time they had finished cutting it out, they were gone. Because after they got over that small patch of grass, it was all rock. They could not put a basketball court there because it was not physically possible. And all the people in that community knew that. But those white Christians did not see those people and their knowledge as valuable. They saw people that needed to be saved. And that is foundational to how religion engages with racialized Black developing countries, because that is religion's role in colonialism, that is religion's role in enslavement, that is religion's role in residential schools. So if religious leaders, if religious groups decide that we want to be a part of the deconstruction and dismantling of the system, well, religious groups also have to hold their leadership accountable that don't want to claim responsibility for their part in the harm, for their part in colonialism, for the fact that, yes, after Escham made this plan, he was able to go to church and get blessed by his priest. These are things that we know about these systems. So until religious leaders are able to name and say, we've been a part of this, there is a reason why they could go to churches and say, will you take these children and indoctrinate them that we have kidnapped from these families? How are you talking about that within your congregation? What are you doing on Sunday school? How are you talking about harm within your religious group as actual harm, and not instinctively assuming that within this religious space, we can heal ourselves? Because in other spaces outside of the church, we have to go to those traditional carceral systems. The criminal justice system handles us. So there's also this Puritan righteousness that happens within religion. So if I commit sexual harm, it is a crime. But if in a religious space it is committed, you have fallen short of God and you just need to reconnect with God for you to be healed. All of those conversations, all of that needs to be truly addressed within the religious space. You have to have those ugly, uncomfortable conversations as religious leaders. You have to ask yourself, why are you continually sending missions to Ecuador without even trying to learn Spanish, first of all? So when you get to those small Ecuadorian communities, those people need to learn English to speak to you. All of the things that are ongoing about colonization through global politics, through foreign relations, through racial capitalism, many of them, much of that is perpetuated through religious missionary work. It is perpetuated through religious missionary work. So if you want to be a part of the change as a religious leader, you're going to have to show up on Sunday with a sermon that says, you know what? We're not going to talk about the Bible today. We're going to talk about the ways in which we were a part of settler colonialism, and we continue to be a part of settler colonialism in our practices and in the way that we position non-Judeo-Christian faith.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's also making those connections and having that language to be able to link that Protestant work ethic to capitalism and that individualism that makes, that it sort of embeds this idea that you have to work and produce to have value, right? So actually, I'm going to read out this question because I'm supposed to read out questions because this recording is not going to show them. So I'm going to read it out. As a local faith leader in a Protestant denomination, mostly white, how can we lend ourselves to the deconstruction of our own harmful systems from the inside in an effective way in terms of both climate justice and white supremacy? We are having these conversations in our congregation, but how can we make more of an impact for real change? I do feel that Teneile has did just field that question, and thank you for it. And I hope more faith leaders step up. I think this is also fodder for another panel or another discussion in the future. But certainly within these congregations. There was a question for Karen. I'm going to read it out. The reason many Indigenous families don't participate in being foster parents is because they feel they put their own families and children at risk of being apprehended because they don't meet colonial expectations. How do you think you can change this? So, Karen.
Yeah, that's a really big question. But I do think it does stem back to what we were talking about earlier, right? That this, speaking about how religion and, the Protestant religion in particular has impacted our systems. It is rooted in saving people. But what's underneath that is we have all the right answers, right? We have the right answers, and therefore we need to save you. And that shows up in our system too. It shows up in our assessments and in our tools, and that's what this person is referring to is the assessment that's done for somebody to be a foster parent. It's a challenge because those tools are mandated by the ministry. What I can tell you is there is a different tool to assess Indigenous families. It's called Heart and Spirit. It's new, and it is culturally responsive, but it's a challenge, and I can't lie about that, right? We talked about foster parenting being a privilege. It is. I mean, it's part of the tool. How many bedrooms do you have? Do children need to share rooms? Certain rules around not being able to share a room, if they're of different sexes. So, it's a challenge. I think the big question has already been answered, right? Can the system change itself? Can we change from within the system? I think we're all grappling with that. I've heard some of my colleagues say today, we'll dismantle the system. Okay. But what then will we have instead? And I agree with all of the comments around, you go to the community. and you ask the community. And, I certainly think that that's the direction that we want to go into, and sovereignty is really key to this. But it takes time, and I know that's frustrating.
I'd just like to comment a little bit, because we've talked about religion as this sort of savior for us. And there's, again, a whole lot of saviorism in climate and environmental organizations. And I think being in a place and knowing the solutions, or the adaptation management, or anything that we can to make sure communities are resilient to climate change, are really important, because we have so much broad application of climate solutionism to everything. Like, we need this big push. We need everybody together. Again, that unity, which I find very suspicious. And it's actually detrimental to a lot of these communities who we like to talk on behalf of about climate change. Is like, we have to save these people. We need to make sure they have solar. We need to make sure they have this. We need to make sure they have progress. What is progress, and how do we determine what that looks like for everyone? And a lot of what we consider to be progress is colonial. Most of it, I would say. And I think we really need to think about communities on the ground. And I think we're going to see more change if we give resources to a ground up. Very much, it's not coming from the top, quite frankly. Climate change, climate action is not going to come the way that it needs to come, in equitable ways from the top down, because we live in a colonial system and we live in a white supremacist system. So what we need is to give resources from the bottom up. And we say, like, we have to dismantle it, but what's going to come next is not necessarily our it's not up to us to if we say we want to dismantle a system, we don't have to have the answers for what it's going to look like to come after right away. We have to build that world. And that is what we are looking towards right now. And it's scary, but we need to rebuild something different. And we haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen the world we need yet. And it's going to be created. And we can't just say we can't dismantle it before we know what we're going to have.
I want to jump in because Meg talked about colonialism and order, and that statement of what will we find in its place. I don't know if Karen is aware, but I think when you speak to grassroots activists, when you speak to people who advocate the systems, when you speak to people who put themselves on the line, this is quite often the question that is put back on them when they present their ideas. Quite often they don't have several graph charts and different layers, and significant researchers have contributed to show evidence. Different versions of that question are put forward to say, oh, this isn't going to work. And it's recognizing that question within of itself is colonial. That idea that, one, we must have exactly what's going to come after clearly, and embedded into this concept that there is no other version, that no other version is going to work, because the people who designed the architect of the system have not seen that other version. But they have seen that other version because it existed when they destroyed indigenous families. It existed when they enslaved African families. It exists when communities come here and they struggle to adjust. There are other versions of community care. There are other versions of family healing. There are other versions of protecting and caring for community and making sure that they don't fall apart. There are other ways to have conversations with people about their trauma than what exists on foster care forms. The other ways exist. Communities engage them on a daily basis to survive the system. That point around indigenous families not applying because they need to meet colonial expectations, that speaks to what is wrong within that question, because what it says is indigenous ways of caring need colonial validation in order for them to be approved, so that we can say these indigenous families get to keep their children. These other ways exist. They exist in other countries. They exist where I'm from. There are so many ways that people love and heal and develop and govern and live. But the colonial structures are not open to those ways, and they have vilified them and called them uncivilized and archaic and savage, and so they don't see them as options. So I see that as a way that we have all been colonized into the colonial ways of thinking. And even as we try to dismantle and challenge them, we don't realize when we're asking the colonial questions that maintain and uphold the system in its current form.
Yeah, and it's, the these colonial systems really delimit our imagination. I say this all the time. We're not, when you say, you know, what comes next, or you know, what will take its place, it's really a question of imagination, right? And it's also about risk. It is a big risk to deny or make these big refusals of things that we're told and taught that we need. You know, I want to say not many not many EDs of big organizations that, you know, embody carceral logics that live in the wake of these systems of harm would be willing to wade into these conversations. So Karen, I want to give you a chance to respond, and you know, commend you for that.
Well, first of all, I want to say I've ticked some people off, obviously, and you know, I step into this all the time. So I wasn't implying that, well, there is no other answer and we've got to figure that out. I was just implying it is going to take time because our systems are so entrenched. I was going to say something, but I lost my train of thought because I wasn't prepared for what you were going to throw at me, Fitsum. You know, I'm not saying that that we have a great system here. I'm here to say I think I was invited here because I put my hand up to say we don't, right? And we have a lot of learning to do and a lot of unlearning to do. You know, I'll just say if I've ticked somebody off, I apologize. I grew up in this system, so I don't get it sometimes, and I'm totally open to being challenged. That's how I learn and that's how I grow.
I will say, and I think in this moment we're in the process of, to use colonial language, modeling a difficult conversation. The first thing is, I would, and I'm going to speak for Meg as well, we're not ticked off. We're just being truthful about the systems. And I think in this particular, I mean, we both represent systems here. I'm representing the education system. You're representing family and children services. These are complex systems to be a part of. And within those systems being challenged, we will instinctively be challenged. You as ED, you know, I think in response to the question earlier, Fitsum was like, you know, Karen's here because Karen is a final buck of accountability within that system. And I think what he was naming there is that to put that team in this conversation would actually put them at risk of being harmed because they're within a system that perhaps does not allow them to be their full Indigenous selves in their work, right? So absolutely, I think we're all here for the same thing. And a part of that process is us recognizing and learning the ways in which we don't see the systems that we're in, because that question is not unique to you or to your system. It's something that comes up in corporate, in education, in healthcare, in policing. And so I think it was important to name that for everyone that's in attendance, that this is a systemic concept, and that it also speaks to the challenge that you have in trying to push a system forward. And so, no, I'm not kicked off. I guess I'm just always having uncomfortable conversations. I'm just used to it at this point.
And I welcome uncomfortable conversations, right? I've been uncomfortable for a while now, and you know, so I'm not defensive at all. I just put that out there.
Well, you know, it's you know, Joy James, Black abolitionist, you know, she said that, you know, she argues that revolution as a singular phenomenon, you know, it terrifies people. It is very destabilizing to think about existing outside of prevailing norms and structure. These are big risks and these are big refusals. And you know, my hope is that this conversation reverberates in our community and elsewhere. These conversations are happening all over the place in communities. So I'm very happy that we could have this conversation today. I think I'm going to wrap up because I think we're sort of there. There's 5 minutes left. If there are any sort of last final things that need to be said, Deb, I'm not sure. Maybe I leave it to the panelists or the things that logistically you need to say. I'm not sure.
I'd certainly let the panelists have their last say, and then I can do some comments as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so maybe we'll start with Teneile.
this is good because I have to return to my system soon, and as I see the time. I think one of the things that I can offer the community is to recognize and accept, and for the system, that the community has a right to challenge you, and that as systems leaders, we have a responsibility to educate our community on how they can challenge us, because that is how we empower them to keep us accountable. And right now we do a really, really bad job of that. The ways that we need to be held accountable should be held in the hands of the system, in the hands of the community. And right now, we do not give them that power because we withhold things from them. So we need to break down the pieces, the language, how documents are kept, the way things are explained to people. Those things are all designed to ensure that the community could not ask questions. And we need to start shifting that, because then the community will teach us how to dismantle our systems in order to ensure that they are truly equitable, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and decolonial. So as systems leaders, how are we going to move into the next phase of change and empower the system to empower the people to tell us what is wrong? That's my final thought.
Oh, okay. Megan, is there anything you want to?
I really want to encourage people to think about climate as something more than a technological shift. We need to envision better futures, and right now we're stuck on a precipice of, are we doomed? Are we not doomed? And I don't think those are useful questions. How can we make a future that looks fundamentally different than what we have right now? And it's scary. Change is scary, even good change. I am always uncomfortable when I talk about these sorts of things because we don't know. There's that void. And right now our current systems have limited our imagination and limited the scope of our vision and our ability to envision these different futures. And if we think about climate change as just a technological problem, we don't see the different ways in which we can live, like abolition and different ways of living, different relationships to the earth. And white supremacy is absolutely one of the functions of that limitation. So we need to we need to engage with our own whiteness. We need to engage with white supremacy everywhere we see it.
Thank you, Megan. Karen.
Well, I just want to, just say that I'm really thankful for the opportunity to, to come here today and to speak about the child welfare system. I am passionate about, helping parents and helping children when they need help. I think we've got a lot to learn about what that help should look like. And I welcome taking a look at our system, because I'm here because I know the system needs to change. Jenny just wrote something to me in a chat, and she left her phone number. So I just want to say I did take your number down, Jenny. So thank you.
Okay, so I think there were other questions or requests to connect. I know that the staff is going to take that information and connect people as needed. But Deb, I'm going to flip it to you to sort of wrap things up.
All right. I don't know how on earth I sort of wrap up that conversation, but all I can say is wow. Like my phone is kind of lighting up with comments around wow. I think that our goal for this session was achieved. Our goal was to really have a conversation that just tears things apart. And I think really, again, echo my opening comments of thanks to Fitsum for navigating this very challenging conversation in a very respectful way, to the panelists for being very open and really sort of deconstructing your own systems. I mean, I think that was our goal, was to hear from the systems themselves. We have had other events in this series that have centered the voices of people who have been impacted by these systems. Our goal with this session really was to hear from the systems themselves. What are you doing? How are you addressing this? What are you thinking about? And just, really looking at those issues. So really appreciate everybody for your willingness to engage in this. I'll admit I need to go back and watch the recording. There was a lot I missed. So that's a note for all of you out there. Reminder that all the sessions are recorded. Please do that. Huge thanks to the behind the scenes crew of Abby, Shama, Julie, and Mariana, and our other teammate, Michael, for all that they've done to support this event. People are sort of wildly working away behind the scenes to make it all work. So really appreciate that. We do have a survey. And again, I'm just so aware of all the colonial tools and all the, so surveys. Anyway, we have a survey, but we do look for feedback and on the events. And, to those who have challenged us in the way we've organized this event, I appreciate that. And that will definitely cause us to go back and have some conversations about, this is our first attempt on this series. And I think we've had really good conversations. Can we do better? Absolutely. So really appreciate everything today. And those are my final comments. Thank you, everybody, for coming.